Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're starting fresh here again. My name is Matthew Courtney. I'm a policy advisor in the Office of Continuous Improvement and Support at the Kentucky Department of Education, and I'll be leading you through this webinar today on evidence-based practices and the ARP ESSER local planning. I do need to say before we get started that this meeting is being recorded, and we will be sharing a link to the recording most likely in the coming Commissioner's Monday message that you'll get next week. It takes us a couple of days to get those recordings up and posted. So let's take a look at our agenda for this meeting. Over the next hour, we've got really 4 buckets or themes that we're going to talk about. We're going to start with an overview of ARP ESSER local planning requirements and specifically compliance requirements centered around the evidence-based practice component. After that, we'll review a definition of evidence-based practices under the Every Student Succeeds Act. We'll review a handful of resources that may help you in your planning process, and I'll give you some points of contact across the department who can help you along the way. A couple of things to note before we get started. The first thing is that all cameras and microphones have been automatically muted for all participants. So if you have questions, I'm going to ask you to put those in the chat box throughout the presentation. I will stop at the end of each of those themes to address any questions that may have arisen during that process. And I will also stay on at the end. I'm here until you're ready to leave today, so I'm happy to continue to answer questions on the back end as we move forward. The other thing I will say about this is that everything after that first theme, once we finish talking about ARP ESSER local planning requirements, everything else is review from previous material that we've done here at KDE. So if you've got other things you need to do, if you're double booked this afternoon, that would be an appropriate time. If you've already seen that material and you need to log off, stick with me until about slide 7 or 8, and then that would be an appropriate time for you to log off. Everything else is repeated of previous material. All right, so we're going to start here with our ARP ESSER plans. Remember that there are 3 components to the ARP ESSER plan that you're required to complete by the U.S. Department of Education. The first component is that GMAP component where you're going to actually build your budget, complete your assurances. That's what you're turning into KDE so that we can release your last third of funding. You're also going to do a public-facing ARP ESSER plan, which is the narrative that goes along with your GMAP budget. That's a public-facing document. And then you're going to do a continuation of learning plan that is also a public-facing document. So we're going to specifically be focusing on the ARP ESSER plan. That's the narrative component that goes along with your GMAP budget. That is that public-facing document. We're not going to be talking about the continuation of learning plan today. That'll be a topic for a later webinar. So I want to start just reviewing broadly the requirements of that ARP ESSER local plan. So the first requirement is that plans must be posted to the district website by July 31st, 2021. So you've got about 6 weeks left to get that plan built. Again, that goes right along with your GMAP, and that deadline aligns with your GMAP. So you should be building your GMAP plan and your ARP ESSER public-facing plan at the same time. They should align with one another, and their due dates align with one another as well. 4 things that must be included in that public-facing plan. First, the extent to which and how funds will be used to implement prevention and mitigation strategies consistent with the CDC guidance on reopening schools. Second, how the LEA will use funds to address the academic impact of lost instructional time through the implementation of evidence-based interventions. Third, how the LEA will spend the remainder of its funds. And fourth, how the LEA will ensure that interventions address the academic impact of lost instructional time and respond to the academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs of all students. This public-facing plan may include a copy of your budget from GMAP, or you can choose to create your own budget format. It doesn't have to be the same formatting, but it should be the same stuff. It's the same plan. They're companion documents. And it must undergo meaningful consultation with stakeholders. For more information about meaningful consultation with stakeholders, I would encourage you to go back and review the archive of the superintendent webcast from last Tuesday, I think it was, where we discussed meaningful consultation and how the U.S. Department of Education has defined that. So in the plan, what must be evidence-based? So the interim final rule is what spells out what must be evidence-based within the plan, and it calls out three things. First, all summer enrichment programs. So you're probably not using ARP ESSER funds for this summer's program, but anything that you would plan to do next summer or the summer after that using your ARP ESSER dollars must be evidence-based. Any after-school programs that you're planning to pursue in the coming school years must also be evidence-based. And then this is kind of the big bucket kicker that they threw in. Interventions that respond to the academic, social, emotional, and mental health needs of students, particularly groups of students disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So basically, everything else. So most of the stuff that's going to end up in your ARP ESSER plan must be evidence-based and must have some research support backing it up. I've bolded this last section, particularly groups of students disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, because when we look at the definition of an evidence-based practice here in a couple of slides, that group of students is going to be an important element for us to think about. So to sort of sum up this slide, most of the stuff that you're going to be putting in your ARP ESSER plan should have some evidence or research backing supporting that purchase. The exceptions to that are probably going to be things like PPE, any kind of HVAC work that you're having done, some of those other pandemic specific activities that you might be funding, but any intervention, academic, social, emotional, or mental health that you put into your plan must be evidence-based. So what's that going to look like from a compliance perspective? So we'll see in a minute that there are 4 levels of evidence in the Every Student Succeeds Act definition of an evidence-based practice, and all 4 levels of evidence are allowable under this program. So that's a pretty low threshold compared to some other federal programs. So it should be pretty easy for you to meet that evidence-based practice minimum compliance threshold as you write your applications. Districts should maintain local documentation, and we may request to see that during program monitoring. So as of right now, we're not asking you to submit anything to the department and related to evidence-based practices under ARP ESSER. But we do know that in the future, we are going to be required by the federal department to monitor and audit ARP ESSER programs. And so you should plan for that now. And as you're writing your plan, as you're looking at documentation, you're reviewing evidence, you should be keeping a folder of all of that so that it's ready to go when we're monitoring. We don't know what monitoring is going to look like. USED hasn't told us the minimum requirements yet. So this is sort of a better safe than sorry measure. Go ahead and document everything, keep it in a good, safe local space so that you can share it if we ask for it. It is also considered best practice to cite evidence in your planning narrative. So as you're working on that public-facing document, cite your evidence writing your narrative, just like you did writing a paper in grad school. That's going to make monitoring very easy moving forward. It's going to make all of your evidence-based work very transparent for your stakeholder groups. And it's just widely considered to be the best practice in the field for this compliance process. So think about that as well as you're writing your narratives, anywhere where you can put in citations, maybe you include a references list, however you choose to do that. That's going to help you ensure that you are compliant in this program moving forward. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions in the chat. And I'm going to give you just a second to add questions to the chat if you have any about the plan itself and those compliance expectations before we look at the definition of an evidence-based practice. I do see a couple of hands are up, so please remember that microphones and cameras are muted, so you will need to put those questions into the chat box if you have your hand up. Alternatively, you can email me and we'll give you access. I'll share my email with you at the end. I'm just going to pause for another beat of wait time. Will you receive a copy of the PowerPoint? We're going to share the video of this, and then we'll have to figure out We're in the process of moving some of this stuff on the KDE website. So I want to say, yes, I'm going to share a copy of the website. You might have to email me if you want it today, because we don't have a great mechanism to do that right this second. But we will share the PowerPoint. We will also have the link to the recording. The funding matrix is being finalized. I would expect it to be released in the next week or two, but I'm not from Office of Finance and Operations, and so I can't speak to that with any certainty. If you want to send me an email, I'll put my email up at the end. I'm happy to forward that question on to OFO for you. All right, I'm not seeing anything else. I'm seeing some people start to drop off, so I'll just reiterate what I said in the beginning, because I know we're all busy and it's summer. Everything in the presentation from here till the end is review from prior evidence-based practice work. So if you've participated in evidence-based practice trainings from KDE in the past, you've seen all the slides I'm getting ready to share with you. So I'll just throw that out there. And we will transition now onto the definition of an evidence-based practice. So all of our definitions of an evidence-based practice do come from the Every Student Succeeds Act. ESSER is the first federal statute in education to really give us a clear definition of what it means when it's referencing research and evidence. Under previous iterations, we talked a lot about research-based, but we never really had a definition or a framework for what that is. And so ESSER gave us a framework for that for the first time. And if you've been following this conversation, you'll know we've been telling you from the department for a couple of years that we anticipate that future administrations will apply evidence-based practice provisions to other pots of federal money. And so we're seeing that now with this process. This is the first sort of new pot of money that this administration has managed, and they've applied these provisions to that. So it's a good time to really study up and learn the sort of nuances of this. At KDE, we have an evidence-based practice webpage. I'm going to drop the link to that in the chat now. And on that page, you will find this document that you see on the screen, which is the ESSER evidence levels. What we've done at KDE is we took all of the pieces of an evidence-based practice definition straight from the ESSER and also from the Code of Federal Regulations and from non-regulatory guidance. We merged it together into a rubric that you can use for sort of a quick reference guide for the different elements of an evidence-based practice. So I'm actually going to use this document as I go through the rest of this presentation here with you. We'll sort of go through and break it down step by step. This is available on the website that I put in the link, so you can download this rubric and have a copy of it for yourself. So I'm going to start with the headings at the top and just sort of talk a little bit about where all of this comes from. So there are 6 elements to the definition of an evidence-based practice. The first 2 are the level and the study design, and those come directly from the Every Student Succeeds Act. And then the other 4, favorable effects, other effects, what works clearinghouse standard, and sample size and overlap, all come from the Code of Federal Regulations and the non-regulatory guidance. And so those are 2 places where the U.S. Department of Education is able to elaborate on the statute and the statutory language for the first 2 columns. So I'm going to start at the bottom, which is evidence level 4. This is the least rigorous level of evidence, and I'm going to work my way up. Remember that for the ARP ESSER plan, all 4 levels of evidence are at play. So you don't have to worry so much about those levels of rigor for this particular program. But like I said, we do anticipate it being applied to other levels or to other federal programs in the future. So it is good to kind of understand the nuances between the levels. So I'm starting at the bottom with evidence level 4, the least rigorous, and ESSER calls evidence level 4 demonstrates a rationale. And a piece of evidence demonstrates a rationale if it provides a well-specified logic model informed by research or evaluation. So basically, this level is your innovation level. It's what we used to call research-based. It basically says some research about this topic suggests that this program, this practice, this strategy is likely to work for this goal. It's likely to work because no one's actually tested it yet in a more rigorous study. So that's where this is your space to really innovate and really think outside the box. A lot of our pandemic response, actually, I would say probably 90% of our pandemic response falls into this level 4 because it's been 100 years since we had a global pandemic. And the practices and the tools that we have now have never been studied in this context before. What you're going to start to see over the next 18 to 24 months are research journals producing higher, more rigorous tiers of evidence based on the experience during the pandemic. And so they've really focused on what's in this other effects box on this slide, which is an effort to study the effects of the intervention is underway. So if you're doing things at a level 4, if you're adding level 4 evidence into your ARP ESSER plan, you are heavily encouraged to conduct a program evaluation, to partner with your local university stakeholders, or however you can make this work, to do an evaluation and to share the results of that evaluation with the larger community so that we can create more rigorous evidence and make sure that we're always doing what's best for kids. One thing I'll note on this slide, I mentioned earlier that there's some more rigorous rules around evidence for some of our other federal programs. One of those programs is school improvement funds. You're not allowed to use this level on school improvement funds. So if you are working with a CSI school, comprehensive support and improvement school, or you become a CSI school in the future, you have one in your district in the future, this level of evidence will not be available to you in that federal program. As we move up to level 3, we're moving into a slightly more rigorous stance on evidence and program evaluation. ESSA calls level 3 evidence promising evidence, and a piece of evidence is considered promising if it's based on a correlational study design for statistical controls, with statistical controls for selection bias. So the idea here is that we've done some correlative math. We've calculated correlations. We've calculated the strength of a relationship between two variables, and that we've seen a statistically significant or positive effect of that intervention on student results. What you'll see from level 3 all the way up is this language in this third box here shows a statistically significant and positive effect. So basically, if you're looking at a study and you're trying to determine if it's ESSA compliant, if there's no statistics and numbers, it is not going to be ESSA compliant at levels 1, 2, or 3. So that's kind of a good quick check rule. Of course, level 4 is available to you in this program, and so that it's still likely to be compliant, but we're really looking for statistical analysis here. Another important element at level 3 is that the work is not overridden by statistically significant or negative, unfavorable effects in a more recent or more rigorous study. So we know that best practice changes and evolves over time. So we want to make sure that we're always using evidence that is really rooted in the current thinking and the current best practice. It has not been overridden by something else over time. You'll see that these two last boxes, What Works Clearinghouse and Sample Size and Overlap, are grayed out because they don't come into play until level 2. So level 2, we get a little bit more rigorous. Level 2 is considered moderate evidence in ESSA, and a piece of evidence is considered moderate if it's based on a quasi-experimental study design. So here's what that means. We have two groups of kids. One group of kids gets the intervention, the other group of kids does not get the intervention, and at the end of the year we do fancy math to see which group of kids did better. What makes it quasi-experimental is that those kids are in previously assigned groups, like schools or classrooms, which is a little less rigorous than a random assignment, which we'll talk about in level 1. Again, you see that at level 2, we want to see statistically significant and positive effects that are not overridden by something that is more rigorous or more recent. So that holds true here. We're looking for those statistical outcomes. We want to see a positive or favorable statistical outcome from a recent study. You also see we've got two new boxes that have lit up, which is the What Works Clearinghouse Standard and Sample Size and Overlap. So formally, the definition says that at this level, it meets the What Works Clearinghouse standards with or without reservations, or as of the equivalent quality. Here's what we're going to tell you about What Works Clearinghouse standards. The What Works Clearinghouse standards are an incredibly dense and complicated set of research quality standards. It is not a set of standards that most people in the field likely have time or interest to really go in and dig deeply into. So what we're telling you now is that if you're able to verify a What Works Clearinghouse rating through your process, great, do that, but don't spend a lot of time on it. Don't have a lot of pressure on it. We're not going to check What Works Clearinghouse standard ratings when working with evidence-based practices until the U.S. Department of Education tells us that we have to. So we included it on here because there might be a day, this is part of the definition, there might be a day where the department tells us that we do have to check What Works Clearinghouse criteria and standards against all of our studies, but right now we're not checking for that. So sort of do your best with that, but don't allow it to be a hang up or a major time suck for you at this time. The last box that's lit up, sample size and overlap. And this one's really important because we want to be using research that includes a large sample size. ESSER defines that as 350 or more students, and a sample size that is on multiple sites, preferably more than one school or more than one district, and overlaps with populations or settings. So remember in the beginning when I had that bold text about especially students most disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, that's coming into play here. When we're looking at this rigorous evidence and we're looking at these quasi-experimental study designs, we want to make sure that these designs were conducted with students that look like the student population that we need to address in our schools and districts. So if you're trying to solve a problem with English learners, then let's make sure that we're using research that was conducted and included English learners in the sample. Same thing with setting. So if I'm in an elementary school, the best practice is that I'm using research and data that was collected in an elementary school. If I'm in a rural high school, then I want to see rural high school research. You will see that it says or, population or setting. And so that gives you a little bit of flexibility as you think about trying to find research that aligns and matches with your school. Finally, ESSER Evidence Level 1, this is the most rigorous research and study design included in the ESSER framework. I will throw in that arguably there are other equally or more rigorous designs out in the world, but they're not included in our definition. So we're sticking strictly to that federal definition today. ESSER Level 1 is considered strong evidence, and a piece of evidence is considered strong if it's based on an experimental study design. So like a quasi-experimental, we have two groups of kids. One group gets the intervention, the other group doesn't. At the end of the year, we do fancy math to see which group of kids did better. The difference is this time I'm going to put all the kids in a hat. I'm going to randomly assort them. This kid gets it, this kid doesn't. This kid gets it, this kid doesn't. What that does for us is it allows us to filter out all of the other things that go into like a student assignment discussion. So we all know that we don't randomly sort kids into classrooms within a school, that we very methodically place kids with a teacher or with peer groups, or sometimes not with certain peer groups, to set that kid up for success in the coming year. And so that random sortment allows us to make sure that we filter out all of the reasons that we put a kid with this teacher or that teacher. Again, you'll see that we have statistically significant and positive results that are not overridden by something more rigorous or more recent. So that's going to hold true. We're going to look at the math. We want to see statistically significant outcomes. And we want to see that this is a recent study, that not something that's 25 years old that's been overturned. Again, there's that What Works Clearinghouse box. This time it says meets the standards without reservation. Again, do your best on that, but we're not going to hold you to that box because we recognize that that's a very rigorous process and time-consuming process. And then finally, the sample size and overlap box. Again, we want to see that large and multi-site sample, ideally overlapping with populations and settings. So we want to see kids like ours in schools like ours. And if we're focusing on that bolded language in that previous slide, we want to see kids who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. We want to see those kids reflected in the research. So we would encourage you to dig very deeply into the research and really take a good, thoughtful look at that. One thing I'll also say about this is I often get questions about that and in level 1 and or in level 2. You do have a little bit of flexibility as we think about moving between the levels in this particular federal program, because again, all 4 levels of evidence are at play. And so it's unlikely that you're going to find a piece of evidence that fits very neatly into one specific level. And luckily for this federal program, they don't really have to. So I'm going to pause here again, and I'm going to check the chat box to see if I've got any new questions. I don't have any new questions this time, but I'm going to give just a beat of wait time before you transition to look at some resources, and then that way I can answer any questions. So I'm just going to pause for just a second. All right. I know that wait time feels especially painful in an online setting, but I'm not seeing any more questions. So we'll go ahead and quickly review some resources that we have at the department that may help you. So first, this is just kind of a big list of resources here available to you at KDE. All of these resources are available in that link that I shared with you earlier to that evidence-based practice webpage. The first one here that you see is that ESSER evidence levels document. That's the document that I just reviewed with you. You'll also find on that website a glossary of terms and a frequently asked questions list. Those are both aligned to the Federal Code of Regulation. So if you're someone who's done a lot of graduate work, you're probably not going to agree with all those terms and definitions. You're probably not going to agree with all those FAQs because they are very narrowly focused. And the Code of Federal Regulations requires us to strip out some of that nuance that we talk about in academic debate. So I always like to kind of throw that out there before you even access those. But they are strictly aligned, and so they're good resources. We've created our own What Works Clearinghouse user guide. If you're not familiar with the What Works Clearinghouse, it is a database of evidence-based practices maintained by the U.S. Department of Education. We always recommend that that's where you start your process, just because it's sort of the official clearinghouse of the department. But we also have a list of clearinghouses and databases where we've kind of gone through and pulled other evidence-based practice clearinghouses and databases into one spot. So you can access that and look at those resources as well. We also have some toolkits and a couple of recorded webinars on that website. One toolkit I want to bring your attention to is called Empowered by Evidence, Reviewing Evidence Under ESSER. This is a step-by-step guidebook, so to speak, for reviewing a piece of evidence through ESSER's lens. So you can take that, answer the questions, fill the form out, stick it in your folder, in your documentation folder, and you're ready to go. This document has been created so that it is compliant across all of our federal programs with evidence-based practice provisions, so it's a great place to start. It is kind of time consuming, so once you kind of get the hang of it, most schools only do it 3 or 4 times and then they kind of develop their own procedure. And we're happy for you to do that. We encourage you to do that. That's certainly more sustainable in the long term, but it's a great resource to get you started. We also have some other webinars that dig a little deeper into some of the concepts. For example, statistical analysis. If I said that this needs to be statistically significant and you're saying, well, what is that? We have a webinar that will help you kind of unpack some of that as well. A few targeted resources. So if you're working on academic achievement and you're working for interventions to promote academic achievement, we recommend these 3 clearinghouses. They are the What Works Clearinghouse, the Evidence for ESSER Clearinghouse and Database, and the American Education Research Association and their clearinghouses and databases. So these are 3 great places where evidence-based practices are curated through that academic achievement lens, and it's a great place to sort of start and get your feet under you as you start to build your plans. Here are some resources related to non-academic student outcomes. So we recommend the Clearinghouse for Labor Evaluation and Research, also called CLEAR. This is a great place if you're looking for resources related to like job shadowing programs, apprenticeship programs, those kinds of work experience, career and tech ed kinds of things. There's a lot of good resources there. Crime Solutions is a great place to look if you are experiencing juvenile justice related challenges in your school. There's some great interventions and some interesting information there about programs you can do to work with that population. Top tier evidence is another great kind of catch-all for sort of developmental resources. There's a lot of different kinds of education resources there. And then SAMHSA, the National Registry for Evidence-Based Programs and Practices, is an excellent place for mental health and substance abuse. So we've talked a lot over the last year about student social emotional health. SAMHSA is a great, again, national federal database that collects and archives evidence-based best practices in the mental health and substance use community. And then finally, parent and family engagement resources. So we recommend, if you're trying to find new ways to engage parents and families, which we hope you are, and of course there's that meaningful consultation element of this, which is also parent-family engagement. So some places to look for that: the RAND Corporation database. They do a lot of work around parent-family engagement and studying the way that families and schools collaborate. Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development is a great place to look for things related to student developmental activities and sort of how you can bring families into the school or the school into the home to work on student development. SAMHSA, again, is another great resource and top tier evidence. I've talked about both of those already, but they also cover this parent and family spectrum as well. So those are all some great resources that we definitely would encourage you to review as you build your plans. I want to share a couple of points of contact, and then I'll pause one more time to address any additional questions related to evidence-based practices in ARP ESSER. So first, like I said in the beginning, I'm Matthew Courtney, and so here's my name and email address. I'm happy to field any questions for you along the way as you develop your plans. Matt Ross is another excellent contact for you related to your ARP ESSER plan. He's actually in the Office of Finance and Operations. I'm in the Office of Continuous Improvement and Support, so our two offices work very closely together on these plans. So I'm sort of the narrative side, he's sort of the money side. So you can send either of us questions and we'll collaborate to make sure that we get you an answer in a timely manner. And then if you have broader evidence-based practice questions, we have two contacts for evidence-based practices at KDE. They are Natasha Stein and Ruth Swanson. Both of them are incredibly knowledgeable in this content area and are able to help you sort of unpack evidence-based practices from a sort of a bigger perspective. Again, like I said in the beginning, if you have not been following along with evidence-based practice work at KDE, now is really the time to tune in because we do anticipate that as new pots of federal money come out in the future, that there will be more evidence-based practice requirements added along. So now's a great time to visit that website, view some of those webinars, and reach out if you need help. So with that, we've come to the end of my planned presentation today. So I'm happy to stay on and address any additional questions that you would like to put in the chat. If you have no other questions, you're welcome to reach out to us. We will be sharing the link to this recording. We'll figure out how to get the slides to you as well. Look for that most likely in the Monday message next Monday. It'll take us a couple of days to get the video archived and posted. So other than that, thank you for your time today. And like I said, I'm happy to stay on and answer questions in the chat box as long as you need me to. Thank you, Mary. Have a good day. Thanks, Jennifer.